there was Joseph Smith himself in D&C 12820 when he said, "Glad tidings from Cumorah,"
Mm-hmm.
and he said, "A book to be revealed." So that he got the glad tidings of Cumorah before he got the plates, which is what his mother said, that he knew Cumorah, the name Cumorah, before he ever got the plates. And that's pretty explicit, and that's Joseph Smith himself. Now, I know they'll say, well, he adopted this false tradition. But if you go there, pretty much everything Joseph Smith said, you might as well dismiss as a false tradition.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And in today's episode, I have back with me Jonathon Neville. Jonathon, thanks for joining me again.
Hey, it's so good to be back with you.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. We did an interview back, I think it was August or September time, you and James Lucas, and we did a couple episodes on your book, By Means of the Urim and Thummim, and we discussed sort of the Urim and Thummim versus Seer Stone accounts, and you guys gave your theory and your view on the translation of the Book of Mormon, and it was really interesting discussion. I really enjoyed it. I found your book really fascinating as well. And what we're going to be talking about today is the Heartland sort of model for Book of Mormon geography. And Jonathon Neville, he would sort of support the view that the Book of Mormon took place in North America, that the Hill Cumorah in New York was the Hill Cumorah in the Book of Mormon, and he's moved away from the Mesoamerican geography model. Right. And I've interviewed people like Brent Gardner and Jerry Grover. And I think most apologists or faithful scholars that I've interviewed have leaned more towards the Mesoamerican model, be it Stephen Smoot, Dan Peterson, Neil Rapley, whoever it is. And some people have said, you know, to be fair and balanced, you should bring on someone from the Heartland perspective and hear what they have to say and hear their evidence and their arguments. And then so yeah, that's what we're gonna do today. Jonathon's gonna talk a little about Heartland, what caused him to move to the Heartland theory, and then I might ask some questions trying to maybe challenge that view, you know, ask question that people bring up, sort of challenging and almost delegitimizing the Heartland model. So that's the plan for today.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I love it.
So maybe we could start, for any listeners who don't know who you are, who haven't, you know, watched our previous episodes, maybe tell us a little about just your life in the church, your background, some of the books and things that you've researched.
Okay. Well, could be a whole podcast. We'll just do a brief summary. So basically, you know, I've lived in I was born in the US, but I've lived in Europe for 8 years. I've lived in China, the Philippines, Africa, and I've traveled to about 100 countries for my work and then also for vacation. So
we can have an entire podcast about that. Like, that's so fascinating. You've lived all over the world.
It's pretty interesting stuff. And then also, as you can see, we're in my art studio, so I'm an artist. By profession, I've been a lawyer. I retired a couple of years ago, and I had a variety of jobs in the law. But I've always been interested in church history and Book of Mormon topics from a young age. And partly that is because when we were living in Europe, my sister was going to school in Athens, my older sister. So our whole family went down to see her in Athens. And I was about 15, I think, at the time. And we were on Mars Hill. And my father said, "This is the Mars Hill where Paul the Apostle stood." And I didn't know anything about that story, you know, because I was a 15-year-old kid. But we opened the scriptures and we read Paul's sermon on Mars Hill. And I thought, this is where this actually took place. And that generated my interest in antiquities as well as even gospel living, really. Just having that touchstone between what the book of Acts said and actually standing on the spot. So
almost, of course, it was more real.
Oh, totally made it real for sure. You know, all of a sudden it wasn't just words in a book and old people and all that. It was a real thing.
Right.
And we were standing, you know, if you've been there, it's right across from the Acropolis, which is a spectacular setting also. And we also had visited Rome and seen, you know, a lot of the catacombs where the Christian martyrs were and a lot of this kind of stuff. So as a teenager, that made a big impact on me.
I love Rome. We went there last summer. Beautiful.
Did you?
Amazing
Yeah,
city.
okay. Yeah. So it's always been an interest of mine. I visited ancient sites all around the world, you know, from Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat and all over. And so I've had this I guess, a fascination with it, but also related to church history, because I thought, well, if the Book of Mormon is as true as the Bible is, it must happen in a real place, right?
Right.
And so when I went to BYU, actually even before I went to BYU, but I was a real fan of the farms people, Dan
Mm-hmm.
Peterson, Jack Welch, John Sorensen.
Sorting.
I subscribed to their newsletter. I went to their conferences. I read all their stuff. You know, I was all in. In fact, when this book came out, this was John Sorensen's book called An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
Before he published this, he sent out peer-reviewed copies, basically 8.5 by 11 printed material. And I was living in Santa Fe. I was clerking for the Supreme Court there in Santa Fe, my first job out of law school. And one of the guys in our ward was an archaeologist that was a friend of John's. And so John had sent him his preliminary manuscript, and he knew I was interested in this stuff. And so he made me a copy of it. I still have it. And it's a fairly early version of this book. But I was totally all in. I bought everything. You know, I thought, okay, this guy's a scholar. He knows this stuff, and all these evidences of the Book of Mormon, the correspondences that you mentioned. So that kind of got me embarked on meso. And even prior to that, when I was on my mission in France, I was so invested in the Mesoamerican theory that I bought a French book on the Mayans, and I used that in firesides to prove the Book of Mormon. And I still remember I like to do a lot of public events on my mission. I wasn't too much of a door-to-door person, but I was always doing what we called soirees, firesides. And I did a big presentation in this one city, invited all these people, and afterwards I got a lot of pushback because they said, you don't know anything about the Mayans. They had nothing to do with your Christian Book of Mormon stuff, you know. And I was really taken aback because I thought this was all so persuasive and convincing. But that was kind of the first chink in the armor of my Mesoamerican beliefs, you know. But I still came back, and for decades after that, I was convinced, you know, by what these guys are saying about the Book of Mormon in Central America. And then I had written a novel about Native Americans in the U.S. Being able to reclaim their lands under the treaties. I found some interesting legal cases and stuff that I used to create this narrative. And a friend of mine read it, and he said, "Oh, you need to meet Rod Meldrum." I'd never heard of Rod Meldrum, you know. And so, but he was a mutual friend, so he took me to a little event that Rod did and introduced me. And I talked to Rod a little bit, and he said, "Well, if you really want to know this, you need to come to Ohio on a tour." First, I thought, okay, he's selling a tour. But then I thought, well, I've never really been to Ohio. I've flown over it lots of times, but I never spent any time there. So I figured, what the heck? Let's go to Ohio. And it turned out that it was Wayne May and Rod together that were doing this tour. And we went to sites and museums, and I saw all these things that, in my mind at that point, made sense from what the Book of Mormon description was. And that tour probably is what changed my mind about this whole thing. But at least I wouldn't say it was 100% change because I still had a lot of questions, but it gave
How
me a
long
whole
ago
new
was
perspective.
that tour in Ohio
You
and
know,
you meeting
I,
Rod and Wayne May?
I'd say 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years
Okay,
ago,
that's
something
quite
like that.
recent.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was. Maybe even 9 years ago. I mean, time flies, you know, but it was
So we're talking like
7 or 8 years,
2014, 2015-ish.
somewhere in that time range. Yeah. Actually, I could probably pull it up if I find when my first book was published, because what happened during that tour, I said, well, Rod, how do we ever get on this Mesoamerican thing? And he said, well, it's because these articles in the Times and Seasons, which people are familiar with, where it talks about the ruins down in Guatemala and so on being left by the Nephites.
Yeah,
And
like
I
the
had been
Stevens and
familiar with
Catherwood
those, of course.
books.
Yeah, yeah, Stevens and Catherwood books, and then a lot of speculation based on that. So my first inquiry was, well, who wrote those articles? Because, you know, they're anonymous. It says at the end, ED for editor. Some of them say that. And everybody assumed Joseph Smith was the editor, therefore he must have written the articles. In fact, Joseph Fielding Smith included excerpts from those articles in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, which
Mm-hmm.
in retrospect, to me, was a huge mistake. But so I started investigating it, and that's where I did my first book, which I thought was going to be the only book I would ever do on this. And that was called The Lost City of Zarahemla. And in there, I went through the evidence to show that Joseph Smith was never an active editor. He was a nominal editor at best. And an easy way to understand that is at the end of the Times and Seasons, it would say the Times and Seasons is printed, edited, and published by Joseph Smith. But nobody thinks he was down there running the printing press or setting type, right? So he was a
Right. Or
nominal
reading through every
editor.
single article.
Well, that's the editing part, but even on the printing part, it says printed by him, but he had nothing to do with the printing. He was just the named printer. And it's the same with the editing. He didn't have time to be reading articles, let alone writing articles. He was never much of a writer in his whole life anyway.
And the Times and Seasons is almost like equivalent to our Ensign, isn't it? Like it was like the
Yeah,
church magazine printed every month or every couple of weeks, something like that.
it was every 2 weeks. Yeah,
Okay.
well, it was twice a month on the 1st and the 15th in Nauvoo. And it was published from, I think, I'd have to remember, about 1840 to 1846 by the time they left Nauvoo to go to Utah, they stopped. And it
Right.
had a variety of editors. Joseph's brother, Don Carlos, was an editor. He was actually kind of the founder of it. And then after he died, there was another guy who stepped in for a while, and then they turned it over to the 12. By revelation, they said to turn it over to the 12, but Joseph kind of assumed the role of it. And
Right.
so
Okay.
his name was on it for about 8 months as the editor, and then he turned it over to John Taylor. But in the course of my research, I came across this character named Benjamin Winchester. And this might be too much of a digression for what we're talking about today, but I'm
Well,
just giving you
I
why
would
I
like to
changed.
get into that. Maybe if I can ask this question or sort of like make this
Sure.
statement first before we get into specific points, because I do want to hear about the
Yeah.
things that sort of convinced you going
Okay.
from Mesoamerica to Heartland. So the church doesn't have an official position on geography. As I've
Right.
read through what the church has to say on their website, they would just say that we believe that the Book of Mormon took place somewhere in the Americas. Some people believe
Yeah.
the Hill Cumorah happened in Mesoamerica, some in New York. The church has pretty much said, we don't have an official position. You're free
Right.
to argue and speculate over these things. I've done a lot of videos recently on the division that there's been over, like, say, LGBT issues and gay
Hmm.
marriage, and it seems like that's quite a big divide in the church at the moment. I've talked about it with Jacob Hansen or Greg Mattson, even Jim Bennett in the past. But I think
Right.
in sort of the more scholarly circle, or those people who are really interested in the Book of Mormon or Book of Mormon evidence or research, there seems to be this divide between those who believe the Book of Mormon took place in North America, in Heartland, or those who believe it took place in Mesoamerica. There
Right.
seems to be quite a divide. And I think you've also been, shall we say, a recipient or a victim of some apologists or individuals who have maybe
Yeah.
gone after you a little bit personally. It
Oh,
would
yeah, sure.
seem, for you espousing a Heartland geography theory. And I'm all for,
Mhm.
like, debate, discussion, even criticism or challenging one's ideas or arguments.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
but I think there's a difference when we make it personal. And I think it's
Yeah.
it's a pity when there can be such a big divide over, like I think we need to put things in perspective here. Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
over
for
just having a
sure.
different geography model, that it can be very easy to see people as like, oh, they're Heartlanders, they're these crazy fundamentalist
I
literalists
know.
who,
Yeah.
engage in
Yeah.
pseudoscience, and almost see it like an us versus them sort of
Yeah.
thing, and realizing that we're all members of the church. We believe in the Book of Mormon. We believe in Jesus Christ. We're disciples,
Right.
and we should remember the things which were common, that bring us
Yeah.
together,
Yeah. Yeah.
and find
Totally.
a way to have civil discussions and challenge each other's views and theories. But the
Hmm.
church doesn't have an official position, so I feel like
Yeah.
we're free and open to discuss these things. And I found
Yeah.
with you, Jonathan, because I remember Stephen Pinecker was the first person that told me you need to talk to Jonathon Neville, and
Hmm.
before I'd interviewed you, I didn't really know much about you, and whenever I looked at it, looked a little bit of some of your videos with him, I thought, like, he seems kind of old, he seems a bit boring. But then as I listened, you're old, but you're
I
interesting,
know.
and
Yeah.
you challenge the almost like the scholarly consensus, which is kind of
Yeah.
annoying but
Yeah.
interesting and refreshing. And I enjoyed the conversations we have, because I feel like it caused
Hmm.
me to want to dive in deeper into subjects
Yeah.
where I maybe have more of a shallow understanding. So I sort of want to lay that out first, but I think it's important to try to have civil discussions and understand the other person's point of view or their arguments or their position.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, I have a website called nomorecontention.com, taken from Mosiah 1:1.
Yeah.
And the principles I point out there are clarity, charity, and understanding, those three things.
I like
Because
that.
I started, you know, as a result of all these conversations, first off, I should mention, I've been really surprised at how academics respond to criticism, because I'm used to more of a legal context where you're debating a legal point or you're arguing in court or something, but it's all, we compartmentalize, you know, our intellectual arguments are over here, but our personal relationships are over here and they don't interact. So we can be best friends with somebody and argue vehemently against them in court or, you know, in some other forum.
And it doesn't
No
get
problem.
personal.
Yeah, it never gets personal. Well, for some lawyers it does, but generally it doesn't.
That's an amazing skill because it's very easy to make it personal when you're debating over things which seem like,
Yeah.
you know, huge issues that are really important to
Mhm.
someone.
I know. And I guess it's part of the legal training is we learn that we can argue both sides of an issue. It's not that we only take a cause that we believe is correct because we don't know, you know, lawyers don't know but what the truth is. We only know what the various facts are. We try to create a narrative out of that that makes sense, that would persuade a judge or a jury, you know, for our client. But it really is not personal at all. And so when I got into this academic arena, which it really surprised me how these people identify themselves with their theories. And I'm still surprised by that. They take personal offense if you point out errors that they've made or omissions or whatever. And so that was a new thing for me. And it's still a little jarring to me because I don't, and so as a result of that, I delved into the psychology behind contention. And the nearest thing that I've been able to come up with is it's people have they not only identify themselves with their theories and what they've been teaching, but they also have there's a fear mechanism that physically shuts down part of your brain when you're afraid, and it prevents them from looking at other points of view. It's a physical, you know, neurological, I guess, phenomenon that they can track when they do MRIs and stuff. They can see how part of your brain shuts down in a fear mode. And the other element of it is that people seem to feel like they have to have others agree with them because they're insecure about their own beliefs. And so if someone else disagrees, then that's what causes the fear. It's an insecurity. And I think that's really at the core of these critics of mine that just think I'm an apostate and all, you know, those kind of things, because, you know, why go there? Why be personal about any of this? And so that's where I figured if we could focus on clarity, which means let's all agree on what the facts are, and then charity to give everybody the benefit of the doubt that we assume everybody's acting in good faith.
Right.
And the third is understanding. It's not convincing, coercing, persuading, any of that. It's just understanding one another. Then there's no basis for contention, you know. And
And
it's
I
not
think
as
as we
simple
try to understand, I want to very clearly understand, you know, your position, your arguments, what convinced you. There can be more understanding, even if somebody isn't fully persuaded. I think
Yeah,
it's important to
totally.
fully understand other people's
Yeah,
point of view and not
exactly.
be dismissive to it.
Yeah. And that I love, one of my favorite things in life, even though you say I'm old, you know, so I've been around for a long time, but I still play basketball. I do all the stuff I've done my whole life. But one of my greatest enjoyments is understanding how someone else thinks, that it thinks exactly opposite of me, whether it's on politics, religion, science, any topic you can think of. And I
I
have some
think,
really,
go ahead, go
go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah, you go ahead.
I was just going to say the point you made earlier about how often there can be like a fear mechanism when we listen to people who
Mhm.
might disagree or challenge or not come to the same conclusion as us, is it can be very frustrating. I think it's something that I've experienced on this journey when you dive into a topic and you have a certain view and then something challenges that view. And it's almost like you go
Right.
back to the drawing board again. And then once you feel like you've maybe
Yeah.
figured something out, then there's something challenging it again. And it can
Right.
just add more to the
Yeah.
complexity where you can feel like I could go back and forth in this and debate this, you know, for, you know, 10, 20, 30 years and never
Yeah.
know for certain. And that can be the tough
That's
thing.
right.
In one way,
Yeah.
it can be really enjoyable that you're constantly learning. but it can also be very disconcerting that you feel like you can never be completely sure about certain topics.
That's right.
That's the downside.
And that's why people glom onto an idea and just hold on to it no matter what, because it's an insecurity that they have. They don't like this idea of ambiguity or uncertainty. And that's a little nerve-wracking for a lot of people. And so they just, whether they're in terms of religion, whether they're Muslim, Catholic, LDS, whatever they're born in, they just stick with it. And I've done some analysis of why religion is so regional, and a lot of it has to do with this point that people grow up with a religion and they'd rather stick with it than question it. And that I've also done some analysis of the process of conversion, which that would be a fascinating topic for another day. But
maybe another,
in terms of why I changed my mind on this Book of Mormon geography thing, it gets back again to these articles in the Times and Seasons was the whole underlying basis for the Mesoamerican theory. If it wasn't for those articles in the Times and Seasons, no one would have looked at Central America, really, because it was well established that Cumorah was in New York. Everyone knew it in Joseph Smith's day. And so, it was, Oliver Cowdery explained it was a fact, and he was the assistant president of the church. He had been in the repository in the Hill Cumorah in New York, so he knew from his own personal experience. And so, and his article about it stating that it was a fact, which is letter number 7 in the series of 8 letters.
Was that in the Messenger and Advocate?
Yes, first it was published in the Messenger and Advocate, and then Joseph Scribes copied it into his journal as part of his life history, and that's where you can read it in the Joseph Smith papers today. But then the same Benjamin Winchester published it in his newspaper called the Gospel Reflector in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he pointed out at the beginning, he said, well, I asked Joseph for permission to republish this, because by then Oliver Cowdery had been excommunicated, right? So he asked Joseph for permission to republish these articles. And Joseph said, yeah, great, that'd be awesome. Sidney Rigdon thought it was a good idea. So he published them, and then Parley Pratt published them in England in the Millennial Star. And then Joseph gave them to his brother Don Carlos to publish in the Times and Seasons. And that's why they were ubiquitous. Everybody was familiar with these. In fact, in England, they published a special pamphlet that contained just those 8 letters, those 8 essays on church history by Oliver Cowdery. And one comment I saw somewhere in early church history said they sold 5,000 copies of it. And that was around 1842 or so, 1841, 1842. And so that tells me most members of the church in England had these essays in this pamphlet, all right? So it was real well known, as ubiquitous. And so when these articles came out in 1842 in the Times and Seasons about Mesoamerica, they didn't say anything about Cumorah at all. Cumorah was an established fact in New York. But what happened is in the late 1800s, there were some RLDS scholars who started thinking about Book of Mormon geography. And they said, okay, we know that Mesoamerica was where most of these things took place, and we know Cumorah's in New York, but the distances are too far away. That doesn't line up. So therefore, Cumorah must be in Central America. And there's an RLDS scholar named Lewis E. Hills, which to me is kind of a funny in terms of simulation theory, because here's a guy talking about 2 hills, Cumorah, and his last name was Hills. It's kind of an ironic thing, but so he published a map in 1917 that showed Cumorah down in southern Mexico, where Book of Mormon Central and those guys have it today still. This was in 1917. And Joseph Fielding Smith was the church historian. He wrote an article, and I think it was in the Improvement Era, where he said this modernistic theory that Cumorah's in Mexico is going to cause people to be disturbed in their faith, because the church has taught for over 100 years that Cumorah's in New York. So he was opposed to this 2 Cumorahs idea. Well, then it kind of, scholars went back and forth, and around the 1950s or 60s, I think it was, Sidney Sperry, BYU professor, wrote an article, Were There 2 Cumorahs? And that was really where this idea of 2 Cumorahs was formalized as a proposal. And from there, and basically it was based on the L.E. Hills map and theories from the early 1900s. So based on that, John Sorensen and Jack Welch and Dan Peterson, those guys all kind of said, okay, 2 Cumorahs make sense. Even today, BYU Studies has a map showing Cumorah in Mexico, which to me is just kind of funny. At this point, I think it's funny. I don't get offended by it at all. But at one time, like I said, I bought into all that. And then, so I went on this, after I did the tour with Rod, and I did the investigation of the articles in the Times and Seasons, and I became convinced that they were written by Benjamin Winchester. That's a long story to get into, but basically he was a very fervent missionary. He was the youngest adult member. I think he was 16 during Zion's camp. And he was one of the first 70s in the church. When Joseph Smith went to Washington, D.C., he stayed with Benjamin Winchester. They were close friends. And so he was determined to help prove the Book of Mormon. And one of the things he thought, he said, I have a new course of dealing to explain the Book of Mormon, and he linked it to the ruins in Central America. And the Pratt brothers picked up on it, and then, of course, the Times and Seasons did. What people forgot about when I looked into this, people forgot that in Nauvoo, at the same time the Times and Seasons was being published, William Smith, who was Joseph's brother and a member of the Quorum of the 12, was publishing a newspaper called The Wasp in the same print shop. And that came out, I think that came out weekly. I'd have to refresh my recollection, but I think that came out weekly and on the same printing press. And very often, both newspapers had the same content, same articles in them. And when I looked at that, I thought, well, wait a minute, if Joseph didn't have time to be the editor, and William Smith was there editing his own newspaper and printing it with, apparently W.W. Phelps came sometime that summer. So was there any connection between William Smith and Benjamin Winchester? And it turns out there was a very direct relationship between the two. They had known each other. Later on, when William Smith moved to New York to start another newspaper called The Prophet, he solicited material from Benjamin Winchester because he'd worked with him in the past. So I went through this whole thing and unwound their relationship and how it was really William Smith who was the editor of the Times and Seasons. And Benjamin Winchester was sending him articles from Pennsylvania. And once I did that, I said, okay, so these articles never came from Joseph Smith in the first place. It was a mistake in church history to attribute them to Joseph Smith. Well, then, of course, the what I call the M2Cers, the Mesoamerican two Cumorah people, like Matt Roper in particular, just went nuts. And he wrote 3 articles in the Interpreter about how stupid I was and I had everything wrong and all that. And I thought, okay, well, I had a lot of material that I hadn't published in the first book because my editor said I couldn't go over around 300 pages. So I published 2 additional books. I have 3 total books explaining all this in detail
So
about.
was it sort of like the style and the phrasing that was very similar to Winchester, what he had written? Because obviously if it was printed,
Yeah,
you couldn't compare the handwriting.
right. Well, it was the stylometry remains an issue, and that's a longer discussion as well because the articles were edited. So it
Mm,
wasn't like Winchester sent him and they just published his direct words. But
right.
what was going on at the time, people didn't realize that Winchester had more material published in the Times and Seasons than anyone else other than Joseph Smith. And it's because he was sending them articles from his Gospel Reflector, and they published them in the Times and Seasons anonymously. It just said, here's a good article, and it didn't have his name on them. And I made a list of all these in the book, but he was very prolific as an author. In fact, he wrote a book called History of the Priesthood. That was the first book to kind of go back and understand the history of the priesthood from the beginning through the present. He did the first concordance of the scriptures. And John Taylor said every missionary needs this because it was so helpful to have the Book of Mormon and the Bible coordinated that way in a concordance. But he wrote a couple of other books. He wrote the first rebuttal of the Solomon Spaulding theory because he knew Hurlbut. He had a family connection with Hurlbut. He said, that guy's a scoundrel and here's why he's all wrong. So he was very influential, but he was kind of behind the scenes. People didn't
And yeah,
recognize
he's
him.
not really well known in church history
No,
today. Not many people
he's
have heard
not.
of him. I
I
hadn't
know.
heard of him before listening to you.
No, nobody's heard of him. In fact, I hadn't heard of him. The only reason I came across him was actually, oh, I know what it was. As I recall, there was donations to the Nauvoo Library in 1844, and it had a list of people who donated books, and Benjamin Winchester was the president of the library. And I thought, well, who's Benjamin Winchester? And I started looking into him, and that's when all this came out. It became real obvious. He wrote a letter to Joseph Smith one time after Don Carlos died and said, I understand Don Carlos died and who's going to take his place? And he basically volunteered because he was losing money on his own newspaper in Philadelphia. And so he moved out to Nauvoo to work at the Times and Seasons. But he was also very contentious. I have a copy of minutes from the Quorum of the 12 where Joseph said that Benjamin Winchester, what was it? He would cause damage to the church. Oh, he was black at heart and would injure the church as much as he could. Things like that. And it was a very fascinating character. He was publicly censored in the Times and Seasons later on. But Brigham Young wrote this thing saying, Benjamin Winchester is publicly censored and not allowed to preach because he was causing so much trouble. But this was after these articles that were published in the Times and Seasons, the Mesoamerican articles.
And these were dated to what, 1842, 1843 time. So at that time, Joseph Smith, you're saying he was the editor of the Times and Seasons, but your view is that we can't attribute those statements to Joseph Smith, and are even saying that he may not have approved or read through them, edited them. Is that
right? He was. I say he was the nominal editor in name only.
Right.
And he wasn't. And I in my books I cite a couple of examples of where Joseph Smith didn't even know what was in the Times and Seasons until after it was printed and he read it.
Mm-hmm.
And which is another indication he wasn't actually editing it ahead of time. There's the famous error in Joseph Smith history that's in there where it says it was Nephi who appeared to him first, not Moroni.
Right, yeah.
And that was published while Joseph was supposedly the editor. So that's another example of something that slipped by him because he wasn't really editing it. Later on, in fact, later in that year, in his journal, he noted he was reading his history. Everybody thinks Joseph Smith history and the Pearl of Great Price was written by Joseph Smith because it's in first person, but it wasn't. It was written by his scribes.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point he says, I was reading my history. He wanted to know what they had written about him, So, and that's a whole nother can of worms that'd be interesting to discuss sometime.
Okay, so I think I want to come back to did Joseph know, where the Book of Mormon geography happened?
Okay.
The Hill Cumorah, New York. But I actually want to start with maybe you talk to me a little bit about the Heartland Geography Model, or was sort of I know there's not maybe a unified geography. When I looked at different maps for the Heartland, I saw some different maps. So there's maybe not like for Mesoamerica, most people go with the John Sorensen map. Sort of your view roughly on where you think the location was, and maybe you could talk a little about the Hopewell and Adena civilization and anything that you see as evidence or things which you think that correlate, anything in archaeology. I've listened to Wayne May, I've listened to Rob, I've not dived super deeply, so I'm just curious to hear in a few minutes if you could articulate what do you see, in favor for the Heartland geography, in North America. Kind of more in the Northeast, is my understanding.
Well, it really starts with Cumorah, which we can have as a separate topic, but I just want to mention, in my view, the prophets have unequivocally said that the Hill Cumorah of Mormon 6:6 is in New York. And Albert Cowdery said it was a fact and so on. So we'll come back to that.
Okay.
So when I was looking at this, I thought, okay, one way to approach this, again, is kind of like a scientific analysis. You start with an assumption and or a hypothesis, and you try to prove it or disprove it. Mm-hmm. So if Cumorah is in New York, that seems to me that's a pin in the map. You can't move Cumorah. And then the idea of Zarahemla across from Nauvoo, DNC 125 mentions that, and there's some evidence for it. So I said, let's just say for discussion purposes that Zarahemla is across from Nauvoo in Iowa. So, and for your listeners or viewers more than listeners, I have a little map here that kind of shows this. So if you can see that.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see it's more complex than I wanted. I couldn't find a simpler one. But basically, the idea is that Cumorah is up here in New York.
Right.
Zarahemla is over here across from Nauvoo. And the Ohio River is the boundary between the land of Nephi and land of bountiful Zarahemla. So the Lamanites were eventually down here, and the Nephites were above the Ohio River. So let me tell you how I came up with this.
Okay. So this is
So
kind of your specific geography
yeah,
that you
yeah, this
came
is
up with?
based on my ideas here. I
Okay.
didn't draw this particular map, but this is a party
I think
map
this
that
is one of the maps I saw online whenever I
yeah,
looked up Heartland
probably
maps.
is. Because when I did my maps, I did it on Google Earth, so I had the everything plotted out. But when I printed the book, my books were all printed in black and white. So this Ryan Nelson saw my maps and he said, "You got to make these better." So he put them all in color and with more detail. And I'll come back to the maps. But what happened is I had this hypothesis of Cumorah and Zarahemla. And my wife said, well, you ought to be able to explain the geography. So she gave me a list of 300 passages in the Book of Mormon talking about geography one way or another. And I just started going through it. And there were a few that were hard to figure out, but over time, it all made perfect sense to me. And I asked Rod Meldrum once to come up and tell me all his secrets, about the geography, because he and Wayne both had kind of a general map, but there are a few things that they really hadn't explained in much detail. So he came up to my house with 2 boxes full of material, and he said, well, I have to tell you, we don't really know exactly where all these things took place. We can't explain the West Sea, for example, and some of these things. And so, or how the Sidon River is the Mississippi, but it says it goes from the land of Nephi down to Zarahemla, so that would imply a north flowing river, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I took that all into account, and then I realized I used to live in Tennessee when I was a kid. And the Tennessee River, people in the Western United States don't realize this, but the Tennessee River flows north. It goes, and you can see it here. Well, it's kind of hard to see on here, but on this map, Tennessee is down here. And the Tennessee River, it shows flowing north like this.
Mm-hmm.
Might be hard to see.
Yes.
And
No,
so
I can see.
most Americans don't know there's a north flowing river in the United States, but the Tennessee River is. And so my hypothesis was that Lehi landed down in the coast of Florida. And when he left his brothers, he went up to Tennessee. And then when, in the time of King Mosiah, the first King Mosiah, when they had to flee from the Lamanites and they went to Zarahemla,
Mm-hmm.
they just went up the Tennessee River to Illinois. So they went from a higher elevation. That's the other thing people don't realize is Tennessee is a higher elevation than Illinois is, even though it's south. And that's because of the mountains down there.
Yeah,
So
because
the
I
river
know the Book
flows,
of Mormon describes them going like down from Nephi to
right,
Zarahemla in
exactly,
Mesoamerica, that they would have a, in, Highland, Guatemala, going to Zarahemla.
right.
But you say that in your model, you also have them going down from
Yeah,
elevation.
totally.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
so I
interesting.
100% agree with John Sorensen on that point about up and down being elevation, not north and south.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes all the sense in the world. It's just that there is a river that goes from land of Nephi north to land of Zarahemla, which is the Tennessee River, but that's not the same as the Sidon River. And this is where the Meso guys got a little confused because they just assumed the Sidon River was the only river down there. And so it had to flow north. And what I pointed out is, well, the river that they went down from Nephi to Zarahemla was the Tennessee River, but it joins up with the Mississippi River
Can
that's
you show that on
flowing
your
south.
map? On your map,
Yeah,
so I can
this really
visualize.
isn't the best map for it, but I'll try here.
Uh-huh.
So the bottom one is the Tennessee River.
Yes,
Let's see if
I
I get
see.
it right.
Mm-hmm.
Goes down here, and
Mm-hmm.
then it comes up here and it joins with the Ohio River and the Mississippi River.
Okay.
See, and then the Mississippi River flows down this way.
Yes. Okay.
So, and Zarahemla is up here, the city of
Mm-hmm.
Zarahemla. So Mississippi River, a lot of people don't realize, used to be part of the Gulf of Mexico. It extended all the way up into the central part here. But over the centuries, the Ohio River, the Missouri River, and the Illinois River, and the Mississippi River brought so much silt down that they filled in the upper part of the Mississippi River. And in fact, if you look at it on Google Earth, you can still see where the ancient depression from the Gulf of Mexico was. Before they started putting dams on the Mississippi River, it would flood and it would be 100 miles across, which is pretty vast, right? And so now you don't see that now if you go to the Mississippi River. By the way, I should mention that my basic philosophy towards all this is trust but verify. So I've spent a lot of time looking at all these rivers, driving around here, seeing how they flow, learning the history of them and the geology and so forth. When we get to Cumorah, I'll explain that Ashley bought a house out there so I could get to know it. But
Yeah, I remember you saying that on your Stick of Joseph interview. My goodness,
yeah, yeah,
that is
yeah.
dedication.
Well, it's just I'm fascinated by all this stuff. So you can see here that anciently this was, especially when it was flooding, it was 100 miles across. Even before that, this is probably before Book of Mormon times, it was part of the Gulf of Mexico. But the Mississippi River continues to shift course all the time. And that's another thing that makes it confusing for some people because they don't realize how much is buried underneath the Mississippi River. This, in terms of lost cities and so on. The first capital of Illinois was called Kaskaskia, and the Mississippi River flooded it out. It was the largest city in Illinois at the time, but the Mississippi River flooded it out, shifted so that now it's not even in Illinois anymore. It's on the other side of the river, and there's like 17 people who live there. It used to be the biggest city in Illinois, but it's all been flooded. So, but when you understand the rivers here, and again, I wish I had an easier map for you, but you can see that these rivers were the highways of the ancient people, the Great Lakes and these rivers. And so one of the key questions was, well, where is the sea west? And Rod and Wayne, everybody said, well, the sea west is up here, the West Sea, Lake Michigan. You can see there's a West Sea, Sea South, Sea North, and Sea East.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
that doesn't really fit for part of the Book of Mormon geography. And then I discovered there was a passage in Alma that talked about the sea west south. And I thought, well, why would they say that unless there were two sea wests? And I brought that up to one of these meso guys, and he had never seen that before. I mean, he was an expert and all that. And I said, well, what about the sea west south? And he said, he said it didn't say that. And I pulled it out, showed him the scriptures, and he goes, well, that just means they were on the south part of the West Sea or some
Right.
crazy thing.
That was my thought.
Yeah. But that's not what it says. It didn't say we were on the south of the West Sea. It says the sea west south. And so that to me is the sea west south. And once you realize that, then everything fits. It's awesome. So there were a lot of other details in here, like the narrow strip of wilderness. And there's what I call the John Sorensen translation of the Book of Mormon. And that's because he substituted terms a lot to fit his theory. And one of them is the narrow strip of wilderness. He always says it's a narrow strip of mountainous wilderness. And in fact, I've had these same meso guys I was talking to said, well, it's a narrow strip of, where's your narrow strip of mountainous wilderness? And I said, well, it's not in the Book of Mormon. And they said, what? So he actually got out the scriptures and I showed him that they were quoting the Sorensen translation, not the actual Book of Mormon. And so my interpretation of that phrase actually came from a fireside I was doing. And I was talking about this Ohio River issue. And one woman had grown up and she was older than me, even if you can imagine that. And she had grown up in Ohio and had lived there before the dams were built. And she said every summer that Ohio River dried up and we could just walk across it. Nobody could live there because it would be a river other parts of the year, but it was just this big muddy plain that we could go and play on and cross. And I thought, well, that's a perfect description of a narrow strip of wilderness because the definition of a wilderness is where no one lives. And how would you have a narrow strip where no one lives? Well, a river that dries up part of the year is a perfect description of that. So that's what I propose as my narrow strip of wilderness. Anyway, so I did a book called, let me see if I have it here. I did a book called Moroni's America. And this is my detailed analysis of the Book of Mormon geography.
I'm gonna have to read that book. I need to read that. I probably should have read it in preparation for this, but I will get your book and read it because I've got John Sorensen's and Brent Gardner's book, and so I need to read your book as well.
Okay, fair enough. But I'm not doing any of this to sell books, but you have to write a book to explain and answer all the questions people have.
There's so much encompassed in this.
Yeah, but I talk about Alma 22, the Sea West, narrow places. I have a little whiteboard here. Let me see if I can find it.
And while you're getting it, Jonathan, would you think compared to other Heartlanders, do you think that yours is perhaps the most in-depth or thorough or detailed geography? Because one of the criticisms that I've heard a lot of Mesoamerican people say about the Heartland geography models is that one, there isn't a super thorough, in-depth, detailed geography, and they're all there's different variations. And you said this is sort of like your own map. Do you feel, without sort of bigging yourself up, that this is a very thorough, in-depth map correlating
Well,
with
I think it
the
is.
references
In
in the Book
fact,
of Mormon?
yeah, when I was on Google Earth, there's a lot of places names in the Book of Mormon that they don't give enough description to identify, right? And I think that's why if you look at some of the things that the prophets have said, they said Cumorah's in New York, but we don't know where everything else is. And that's the only answer that's legitimate because there's hundreds of possibilities for Book of Mormon locations. And
You're saying
in
there's
the
some
United
ambiguity
States,
in certain like references to
well,
things.
there's ambiguity. The whole Book of Mormon is vague on geography anyway. That's why there's dozens of different scenarios. But beyond that, in the United States, there were over a million mound sites that were developed at one time, and about 90% of those have all been destroyed by farming and action of rivers and other things. So there's only, some people say, about 100,000 left. But out of those 100,000, a lot of them are very small and wouldn't really qualify as a city of any sort. So you're left with, let's say, 10,000 possibilities for Book of Mormon sites. And how do you ever determine which one is which? I mean, we still don't even know in the Bible where Mount Sinai is. There's difference of opinion about that. So it's real easy for us to find variations of interpretation. The only one that's for sure is Cumorah. And that's why I think it's so important to recognize that the prophets have been clear about that. And Al Rikawi said it was a fact. So, but beyond that, it's anybody's guess. And I've seen, I think actually this map was just adapted from mine. I wouldn't say it's exactly mine because Ryan, the guy who put it together, had some different interpretations than I did, and that's fine.
Right.
I'm all in favor of multiple working hypotheses, right? I talk about that all the time. And in my view, as long as you have a rational basis for what you're saying, I'm down with it. I'm fine with it. You know, I just like people to stick with the church history facts, not hide any of the facts, not rationalize them away, and then make something that's plausible. In fact, I know a guy who believes Cumorah's in New York, but the other events took place in Central America, and he has a rationale for that, and I'm fine with that too. I just,
Interesting.
obviously, I think mine makes the most sense, or I would have written it differently, right? And so, but I'm not saying this is the only one that's acceptable at all.
Hmm.
And I'd love to have improvement on it. So,
Okay, so before we talk about, because I do want to talk about Cumorah and the pushback to New York Cumorah, I do want to talk about like
mhm.
did Joseph know, but I'd like you to tell me a little bit about the Hopewell civilization and
Oh
the
yeah,
Adena
okay,
civilization and
yeah,
anything about them that you see, because as I read through John Sorensen and Brant Gardner, and I find the convergences and correspondences really interesting between like things in Mayan
sure.
culture, Mesoamerican, the Book of Mormon, like
Mhm.
things that I've never noticed before in the text. Are there things like
Right.
that you see with the Hopewell or Adena
Oh yeah,
civilization, or
sure.
anything in
Yeah.
archaeology, or like talk briefly about that?
Yeah, well, that was one of my explorations. That's one of the reasons I bought a house in New York, because I wanted to spend some time out there. And I got to know the director of the archaeology department at University of Buffalo in New York. And I went out on some sites with him and we dug around and found some pottery and stuff. But he told me they have over 1 million artifacts in their collection from Western New York that they don't put on display because they don't have the funding. In fact, I was going to open a museum in Palmyra called the Museum of the Book of Mormon. It's online now. It's mobom.org. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that, but he agreed to let me borrow some of their artifacts to put on display. And the reason is that he gave us a list of, it was 20, 30 Hopewell sites in Western New York, which is kind of unheard of because the Hopewell were centered more in Ohio and Illinois, Indiana, but they ended up migrating up into Western New York, and that's where they disappeared, which is what the Book of Mormon narrative is. And the fortifications and things that they had in Western New York are very rudimentary compared to the ones that are in Ohio that are well developed. And so in terms of correspondences is usually what they say. I think that's the term John Sorensen would always
I know
give.
Brent Garner would say convergences, so he would view it
Convergences.
more as like a different to like a parallel, but like it converges, you know, in time, in
Yeah,
location, with the
yeah,
culture and all those things sort of coming together.
right. Yeah, and if you read his work on its own, it's very persuasive. But if
Mm-hmm.
you read what Mayan scholars outside of the little LDS bubble, they think it's nonsense,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so do I. You know, I look at that, I look at what he wrote, and I thought, well, this is really good until you step back and say, wait a minute, you could say the same thing about just about every culture in the world. You could find these correspondences, convergences, whatever. In fact, of all the places I've been, the ruins that most resemble the Book of Mormon was at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, because they have their elephants, the heaven and hell depicted on those engravings. You watch those engravings at Angkor Wat as you go around, it's like they're describing the Book of Mormon, and that's because it's basic human culture to have these similarities. I mean, human culture only varies so much, right? People have fortifications, they have religious imagery, they have wars and battles and kings and all the same stuff. It's ubiquitous. And so what I saw Brant doing in there was really interesting, but I think you could do the same for any ancient culture, find these correspondences or
Okay.
convergences, let's say. So that's how I look at it. It's the same with the Hopewell and Adena. The interesting thing about Hopewell and Adena was that the Adena weren't discovered. Well, they weren't really named until the late 1800s, after Joseph Smith's time. And there was a guy who wrote a book called Cumorah Revisited. This is in around 1900. I don't remember if it was late 18 or early 1900s, but around 1900. His name was Charles Shook, and he was a disgruntled. I think he was from Reorganized Church, but he had come to the conclusion that the Book of Mormon was false because it describes two great nations, the Jaredites and the Nephites. But we all know that there was only one ancient civilization in North America. That was his conclusion in 1900. And that's one of the reasons that these other RLDS scholars focus on Central America, actually. They said, well, Charles Shook says it's impossible in North America because there's only one civilization. Well, after he wrote his book, the archaeologists started distinguishing between the Adena and the Hopewell. And so Charles Shook's book is, in retrospect, is ridiculous. His whole premise was there was one civilization. Now we know there were two, which correspond in time to the
So
Book of
are they
Mormon.
distinguished as like separate civilizations on like different cultures?
Yeah, they are.
A different
There's
time period, almost maybe overlapping.
yeah, yeah. There was some overlap. The Adena were the more ancient ones,
Mm-hmm.
and they had there. I've been to most of these sites in Ohio and Indiana and stuff, even West Virginia, where they had more conical mound structures that they would build, where the Hopewell were more rounded. The Hopewell had more symbolism in their structures and things. But the Adena they were distinguished by some of the tools and weapons that they had, as well as the way they built their mounds. And when they date them, they dated roughly to the Jaredite time period, where the Hopewell were more. In fact, there's a place in I think Malcho Mounds, I think it is, along the Mississippi River. And right on the sign it says, well, the people lived here from about 400 AD to 400 BC, or I'm sorry, 400 BC to 400 AD, and then they disappeared, which is exactly Book of Mormon timeframes. There's another one like that, not far from Kirtland, Ohio, where they say the same thing. When they talk about when the people were there and occupying, it's just exactly Book of Mormon time periods. And I've seen similar things in southern Ohio as well as northern Ohio and Illinois, Indiana, all through there. So that's a whole fascinating long discussion to go through. But I've been to the museums, I've talked to the archaeologists. One of the big disconnects that they say is that these large enclosed, what I would call fortresses, and the early explorers called them forts, they say they were just for ceremonial. There was no evidence of warfare. But that's a little hard to believe because they were built so that they would be easily defended. They weren't just for ceremonies. But that's one of the debates ongoing in North American archaeology, where these defensive or ceremonial. And I even found one in the Ohio, there's a journal called Ohio Archaeology, I think it is, something like that. And early on, when I got into this, I was reading all those magazines and watching their lectures and so on, because I just had to know, you know. And I found one where they said they had done a pit through a site, and they said, well, they couldn't explain what they had found, and that is that there had been an established community of some sort, and after it was established, they built a wall around it. And they said that's the opposite of how normally they do things. Usually you'd build a wall first and then build your community inside. Well, we read in the Book of Mormon that Moroni went around fortifying the cities and building walls around them long after they were established. So that was another convergence, I would say, based right in the journals from Ohio, you know.
And one last question on, you know, your view of the Hopewell civilization and I was about to say the Olmec, but the Adena, because I know,
Adena.
you know, with the Mesoamerican geography model, and they would view that not that the Nephites and the Lamanites, you know, were the Maya, or that the Jaredites were the Olmec, but that they were among and participated in that civilization and adopted the culture. Is it a similar view that you have for the Hopewell and Adena, or do you believe that the Nephites were the Hopewell and the Jaredites were the Adena, or do you believe that they sort of intermingled with people there and were immersed in the culture?
Okay, yeah, let's take those two separate, because there's a different approach for the Jaredites. And because in my view, the Jaredites, when they land, I think they landed in British Columbia, basically, and that's partly because of legends up there that we could talk about.
Well, that was my mission. In the
oh, it was.
Well, it was more Alberta, but I served in a little bit of BC.
Well, I'll just tell you then that you might be interested in this. So there's a museum in Vancouver where they a Native American art exhibit and stuff. And there's a sculpture, you may have seen this, where there's these guys climbing out of a clamshell. In fact, I have a picture of it in my book here, I think. Let me see if I have a picture of it.
Yeah,
I might as well show you rather than try to describe it. It might take me a minute to find it, is the only problem, because I don't remember where I put it.
I can edit this
I can show you later. Okay, but these guys are climbing out of a clamshell, and it's their origin story. And the origin story is that they came over on boats and they had glowing pearls inside. And when they landed, they climbed out of these things, and they were tight like a dish, these little clamshells that they climb out. That's the origin story for this tribe in British Columbia.
That's
and
quite
a friend of mine,
to the Jaredites.
Yeah, totally. And a friend of mine was the director of public affairs there for the church. And he mentioned this to me when we were on a trip together. And I said, what? I got to know more about this, you know? So he had the actual journal of the missionaries who had interviewed. They were teaching these Native Americans, and they were relating their origin story, and they wrote it in their journal, and they sent it to him, thought he might be interested. So I have a copy of that. And they describe this. I mean, it's glowing pearls inside these tight ships. That's pretty much a Jaredite story. So in my view, they landed in British Columbia, roughly, and it migrated. It was Jared and his brother and their friends, it says, right? Their friends, I think, migrated more south, and I think they're Olmec related. Whereas Jared and his descendants stayed in the north. The brother of Jared, we're not sure about, because he kind of disappears later on in the narrative, but one of his descendants shows up again. So, but I think they spread throughout the hemisphere, or at least North and Central America. And I think that's one of the reasons when they crossed from Mesopotamia, they crossed Asia to get to the shores of China to cross the Pacific. And they would have picked up plenty of Asian DNA if they didn't already have it. And I think that's one explanation. I think there are lots of other migrations anyway, not just the Jaredites.
Sure.
But the Jaredites, so as I see it, when Moroni wrote about the Book of Ether, he started off by saying he's writing about the people who are destroyed in this North Country. And that has two significations for me. One is that he was in this North Country, meaning New York area. Because Central America, you wouldn't describe as North Country if you knew anything about the rest of the continent. And the second thing is he limited it to say he wrote about the Jaredites, or the people who were destroyed in this North Country, meaning he wasn't talking about all the rest of the people who came with Jared that were everywhere else on the continent. He was only talking about those that were destroyed in this North Country. So I'm fine with the let's call the M2Cers that say the Jaredites intermingled with the Olmec or were the Olmec or however you want to interpret that, because that's all consistent with my worldview also. I don't have any problem with that. I just think that the Book of Ether is only talking about the ancestors of Ether himself, the 33 generations going back. It was his family line that were in the North Country. And that leads to this issue of where the Jaredite names show up in the Book of Mormon, after they mingle with the people of Zarahemla, what we call the Mulekites.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see the Jaredite names starting to appear, right? And that makes sense to me because I don't think all the Jaredites, well, let me put it this way. The term Jaredites has kind of a dual meaning. It could be literal descendants of Jared, his family line, or it could apply to all the people that came with him. And that's where there's been confusion.
Mm-hmm.
So I think referring to the Jaredites as the ones Moroni was writing about was the family line in the North Country. The broader term Jaredites would have included people who spread throughout the hemisphere. Okay. So I think that people of Zarahemla would have encountered Jaredites using the broader sense of it. And that's what we see with the Hopewell Indians or the Hopewell civilization. They did have some intermingling with the Adena. And it's unclear exactly how much. A lot of Hopewell sites were built on top of Adena sites. And then you have the issue of cross-culturalization, and did they interact or did they come across it after it was ruins? There's a lot of those issues still to be resolved, and it's difficult because they've been destroyed so much. So then with the Hopewell, there's a lot of interesting details here. I was in a museum, and I think it was in Georgia, and one of the placards said that there was mostly hunter-gatherers, but around 400 or 500 BC, they started doing farming. And I thought, okay, why would that happen? And it makes sense if the Nephites showed up and showed them how to do farming, And another little indicia here is when Nephi left his brothers, he said, I took my family and all my siblings and my children and all those who would follow me, and they left.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells me there was more than just his family there.
Yeah, and people in Mesoamerica would make the same argument as well, that there had to have been other people there.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that. The issue is what was the nature of the other people? And Lehi made it really clear that there are no other nations here. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had room for their own promised land. And so what I think is when you have the conjunction of Lehi saying no nation, but it's obvious from what Nephi said that there were other people there, they weren't a nation. They were hunter-gatherers, which is what the archaeology shows. And that's why it makes sense that Nephi would be the king, because these Jews came from Jerusalem with all their education and technology and all that stuff. The local hunter-gatherers would say, okay, you guys are awesome. You can be the king, right? Whereas if they had showed up in Mayan civilization, it would have been just the opposite. If the Mayans would have even let these interlopers survive, which is questionable, why would Nephi be the king? He'd be the last person they'd make the king because they had their own technology, their own civilization, their own kings. In fact, all of their ceremonial stela and all that stuff lists all their kings, and none of them are Nephi or any of his descendants. So that to me, I agree with what I view as the rational things that the Mesoamerican people say, like there are other people here. I mean, that seems obvious from the archaeology. Even Nephi's narrative supports that. But it's irrational, in my view, to assume that Mayans would make Nephi the king. It just is one example of many. Whereas if they showed up in the midst of these hunter-gatherers, which the archaeology shows in Florida and Georgia, then they would naturally make him the king because they had all the technology and the wealth and stuff.
I think I'm trying to remember from reading Frank Garner's book. I think because they believe that the land of Nephi is sort of like highland Guatemala. So I think where Frank Gardner and John Sorensen proposed where they think Nephi and his party landed, I think they believe that there were probably more like villages or like not like large cities there. So maybe it wasn't like there was already massive cities there. And I think an argument in Brandt's book is the emergence of wanting Nephi to be a king was around the time of Mayan kingship sort of came to the forefront. So I think he made the argument of there, there was probably a growing community, maybe like a large tribe, and then, they wanted Nephi
Yeah,
for a king. I think that would probably
that's
be
fair.
their
Yeah,
defense to that.
I'm
So,
sure they would have that. But but you have to get into how do they cross the water too, because when they left, and I talk about this a lot in the book and in my blogs too. When they left the Arabian Peninsula, did they go east or west? If they went east, that means they crossed through the archipelago of Indonesia. In fact, I have an Australian guy there. I have a joke that I do in my presentations because when I was in Brisbane, Australia, once at the temple, the guy told me, "Oh, you're American." I said, "Yeah." He says, "Did you know that Lehi landed here?" And I said, "I haven't heard that one before." And he goes, "Yeah, because it says right in there, the general, whatever his name was, good on you." Oh, they always say good on you in Australia.
okay.
So that was his play on words. But I thought, that makes as much sense as the idea that they crossed through Indonesia and across the Pacific Ocean.
Well, I didn't
There's
consider
no,
that because you believe that they would have came to the east coast of America, so they would have then
yeah,
traveled west, whereas
right.
them believing that like Mesoamerica that they landed on sort of like the west coast sort of Guatemala,
Yes.
then they would
Yep.
have gone east. Okay, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
And that's what, the Phoenicia ship. Are
Mm-hmm.
you familiar with the whole Phoenicia thing? Where
Vaguely.
it demonstrated that that voyage was not only plausible, but likely, because the Phoenicia, their intention was to circumnavigate Africa. And they went down the east coast of Africa, started up the west coast, and the currents kept pushing them towards North America. And they had to try really hard to get back into the Mediterranean Sea. And then they did a second voyage to replicate Mulek's voyage, leaving from basically Lebanon, Tunisia, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and across to Florida. That one was basically Christopher Columbus's route. But the other one, the first one they did, it kind of picked up with Columbus's route after the Canary Islands. But all you do is follow the currents. It's not even difficult to get to America from there.
Okay.
Whereas crossing the Pacific, there's no historical example of that ever happening. The Polynesians took hundreds of years to get from island to island, even, right, to migrate. Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but for me, it's pretty evident that if you're crossing from Arabia to the Americas, you would go through the Atlantic for all kinds of reasons. And now that it's been demonstrated in a 600 BC era technology ship, it seems to me that's a no-brainer. And even John Sorensen agrees that Mulek crossed that way, right?
Right.
So, okay, whatever. I mean, it stretches credulity for me to believe that they crossed the Pacific Ocean. Let me put it that way.
Hmm. Okay, so I want to
But, okay,
transition now to
yeah,
talking about certain topics and then maybe trying to bring up some of the criticisms or challenges
sure,
against
great.
Mesoamerica. So the next few things I want to bring up are I want to ask like a question, but I want to bring up some points that probably Mesoamerican
Yeah,
scholars or proponents would bring up. So, for example, in Joseph Smith's statements, did he know that the Book of Mormon geography took place in North America? So, I'm going to make a few points and I want you to
okay,
respond to them.
sure,
So, I've written here, and this is sort of like me summarizing their arguments that Joseph embraced throughout his life, both North America, but also Central America. We've touched briefly on the Stephen and Catherwood books in the comments promoting the evidence in Central America, and they would use this to say that Joseph accepted Book of Mormon evidence. It seems like wherever it came, and maybe he embraced more of a
right.
hemispheric geography. Now you sort of touched on you don't believe that, although he was the named editor of the Times and Seasons, you don't think that he approved or saw those statements in the Times and Seasons.
Yeah,
Would that be your view?
yeah, that is my view, but let me expand on that just a little bit.
Okay.
First off, when you look at those articles, even today's Mesoamerican proponents admit that they're anachronistic because they were talking about ruins that postdated the Book of Mormon. So if they postdated the Book of Mormon, they could have been constructed by descendants of Lehi in that sense, let's say Lamanites, right?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
this is a really key distinction that I hope your viewers can understand. It's one thing to talk about where Book of Mormon events took place, and it's another thing to talk about what happened outside of the Book of Mormon,
Yes.
either at the time or after Book of Mormon times.
Sure.
And so one aspect of this that I find really interesting is in the Wentworth letter. Joseph Smith said that the remnant are the Indians that now inhabit this country or now live in this country. And he was living in Illinois, writing to someone else that was in Chicago, Illinois. And in fact, I just had a blog post about what this country meant, right, versus this continent. But what people don't, people don't realize how important that is. The Wentworth letter was based largely on a pamphlet written by Orson Pratt in 1840. And in the Joseph Smith papers, they show the 1840 pamphlet as a resource. Even though it wasn't written by Joseph Smith, it's a resource behind the Wentworth letter.
I
So
actually
I
just
did a
learned
side
about
by
that,
side.
although it's in relation to the First Vision accounts. I've been listening to a podcast,
Yeah,
Church History Matters, which I think is a really great
yeah,
podcast, and they actually showed that Joseph was relying upon some of the language from, you said it was Orson Pratt, his
right.
1840 account of the
Yeah,
First Vision for the
yeah,
1842 Wentworth letter. So
yeah.
I can second what you're
Well,
saying.
and here's the thing. Orson Pratt was relying on Oliver Cowdery's church history letters. He quoted
Oh,
from them even.
mm-hmm.
And now you have the scholars saying, well, we can't believe Oliver Cowdery, but they rely on the Orson Pratt stuff. So it's all a mess. But the key point is I did a side-by-side column of Orson Pratt and the Wentworth letter. And where Joseph Smith said the Indians are the remnant of the Indians that now live in this country, he replaced 3 or 4 pages of Orson Pratt's speculation about Central America. And when you see that, you can see that he was just rejecting Orson Pratt's Mesoamerican stuff. If you read the Wentworth letter without that context, you don't appreciate what he was doing there. So you really have to read them side by side. That's why I did. I can give you the link so you can see it. Because if you don't read them side by side, you miss this context.
So you're making the point that
So,
if Joseph embraced sort of any evidence throughout the hemisphere of America, then he would have probably left that included in the Wentworth
yeah,
letter, but you see
exactly.
that as him deliberately
Yeah,
omitting that
yeah.
in your view, Joseph believed that it was North America.
Well, he knew that the Lamanites were the people he was talking to there in Ohio and Missouri and Illinois. He met with the Indians and said, "This Book of Mormon is a record of your forefathers," you know. And in the Doctrine and Covenants 28, 30, and 32, he sent Oliver Cowdery and Parley Pratt on a mission to the Lamanites, which was the Indians in New York, Ohio, and Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no question about who the Lamanites were at that time. But again, this
And
isn't to
what if
say
somebody
that,
were to say that, like for example, the argument you made that after the end of the Book of Mormon, I know in
right,
Alma there was northward migrations. I think
right,
Mark Wright did a fair article about Heartland maybe being like hinterland. He talked about that
hinterlands,
maybe
right.
there could have been northward migrations, and that
Mhm.
some of those Native Americans could have been either descendants of like the Lamanites,
Sure.
or some apologists would argue that Lamanite is more of a broad term in the Book of Mormon. Don't
Yep.
know if you've heard
Mhm.
that argument, and because there's some
Yep.
scriptures that talk about like the Lamanites are those who like fight against the Nephites, where the
Right.
Nephites are those who mix with the Lamanites become Lamanites. And at the end of the Book of Mormon, after Jesus comes, there's like no manner of ites, but then Nephite
Right.
and Lamanite isn't so much like a blood descendant designation, but sort of like those who are
Yeah.
disciples of Christ, those who aren't. So they might say that the term Lamanite could be like blood descendants.
Yep.
I think there's also a revelation I read in the Doctrine and Covenants, but I couldn't tell you what section, where the Lord identifies to Joe Smith to go to the Lamanites, those who are Lamanites, or those who are Lamanites like by descension, almost saying like
Yeah.
almost like adopted as
Yeah.
Lamanites, even if they aren't through blood. So
Yeah.
they might say that it's not exclusively those who are in Missouri are like
Yeah.
Lamanites.
No, totally. Yeah. No,
If
I
you get
totally
my
get that.
argument.
It's similar to what we said before about the Jaredites, where are they the descendants of Jared or are they everybody who came with Jared?
Right,
And so
right.
the Lamanites could be anybody who was on the continent that intermarried or maybe didn't even intermarry. There's either Lamanites or Nephites. If you're not one, you're the other kind of thing,
Hmm.
regardless of your ancestry.
So
So
I
I
think that
get that
the
argument too.
point that I might make that a Mesoamerican proponent might make is that um perhaps the Lord did say that in the Revelation, but perhaps the
Mhm.
Lord had a very broad, like it's a very broad definition for Lamanites. And what if
Sure.
Joseph assumed from that revelation that okay, only those people, are the Lamanites, whereas
Yeah,
maybe it's more broad, if that makes sense.
sure. I get that. There's and this is a problem with stumbling over word placement and what definition of a word, because that's why I like multiple working hypotheses.
Yeah.
Everything you're saying is fine. I'm fine with the Mesoamerican guy saying that. I just asked the question, why would Joseph change what Orson Pratt said if he had no purpose behind it?
Mm.
Because another change that he made there is Orson, as I recall, I'd have to pull it up, but Orson Pratt said they were all let's see, they were all Israelites. And Joseph said, well, they were mostly Israelites, which implies that there were some non-Israelites in Lehi's party.
Mm.
So that's a type of a specific change that is not just arbitrary, I don't think. And so you really have to look at it side by side to see if it's significant or not.
So
But like
you
I
would
said
believe that
earlier,
Joseph viewed the Native Americans in North America, specifically like what Illinois, Missouri, that they
yeah,
are the descendants of the Lamanites, and
yeah,
that's where he believed the Book of Mormon geography happened, and you
yeah.
would view those later statements in the Times and Seasons, or people like, was it like Orson Pratt, who sort of pushed more of a hemispheric geography.
Yeah,
You
Orson
don't
and Parley
believe that
both. Yeah.
Joseph embraced a hemispheric geography?
I don't think he did. And I think that's why he made this change. And notice in the Wentworth letter, he doesn't say the Lamanites are the Indians that live in this country. He says the remnant and the remnant
Yeah.
of the nation. So he was not necessarily not saying they were Lamanites, but that isn't the word he used. So if he says the remnant of the people he was talking about are the Indians in this country, that's different than saying the people in this country are the only Lamanites.
Right. Yeah.
So, and I mean, there's history shows us that people from Central America came up to North America when they had their basically their apocalypse down there, and they all had to leave. They came up to North America. They started the Mississippian culture. They started emulating the grand terraces and things that they had built in Central America up in North America. Even
Hmm.
Cahokia is a Mississippian structure that looks like Central America, although it's made out of earth instead of stone. So there's plenty of opportunity for people to intermarry and mingle of family lines and ideology and all that stuff. That was all post Book of Mormon times.
Okay. The
The
next
other
point I want to
thing,
make is
well, along those lines, so we don't want to forget what Joseph said when he was crossing Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, when he said they were crossing the plains of the Nephites, right?
hmm
And picking up their bones as evidence of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon. I know Mark would say, well, that's part of the hinterland thing. And
yeah,
I would
there
say,
could have been
okay,
northward migrations, and maybe
yeah,
some of those people maybe were people, from the Book of Mormon, and maybe Joseph
sure.
did have a vision of Zelph, and then he interpreted that, oh, that means these are Book of Mormon lands.
Yeah, yeah, could be.
So
But
yeah, go ahead.
when you read what you have to rationalize away what he actually said to reach the conclusion that it was not really where the Book of Mormon took place. So,
So um whenever I chat with Brant Gardner, so we know that Joe Smith had visitations with Moroni, and
mhm,
visions, and he told some of his family members that he saw, some of the former inhabitants of this continent, like their manner of dress, and warfare, and the animals they had, the houses and cities they lived in, etc. Um,
mhm,
and he made the point to me that even if Joseph, say, had visions, was shown the people, that it maybe wasn't clearly showed to him the exact geography of the Book of Mormon. Even if he saw
sure,
it, that doesn't mean that he was given a map of the Book of
right,
Mormon geography. So he would make that
yeah,
argument that even if he saw visions of it, that it was never revealed to Joseph in a revelation, or even by
sure,
Moroni, exactly the geography.
okay,
And perhaps they would say that maybe Joseph had his own views, or his own inferences, or interpretations, for
mhm,
example, that maybe some of it came from revelation, but then he not always revealed through revelation. Like, what would you
yeah.
say to that?
I'm fine with that as one of multiple working hypotheses. No, I mean, it seems obvious that he
I
has
like
to
that you're
say that.
open-minded.
Yeah, well, I used to believe it for a long time,
Hmm.
so I can see why people would believe that.
Hmm.
It's not an irrational thing to believe. I think the evidence is weightier, let's say, on the Heartland than it is for that, because if Joseph was crossing what he called the plains of the Nephites, he recognized it as such. So maybe he was speculating, but if he was speculating, it's hardly evidence of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon, it was a
Yeah, and
speculation.
somebody could say that, because some people would say, no, I think maybe he did genuinely have a vision. Maybe there was someone called Zelph,
Mhm.
but this could have been, northward migration, so they might still view it
Sure.
as, the main geography of the Book of Mormon took place in Mesoamerica. And someone else might say, like, these are different accounts of people recording what Joseph said. What if Joseph is just, because we don't believe prophets are infallible, what if he was just sort of speaking as a man in this instance?
I know, but see, we don't want to get too much in the weeds because I don't want to lose the overall perspective here.
Yes. Yeah.
For me, this whole issue boils down to, we know what Oliver Cowdery and Joseph's contemporaries and Joseph himself said about Cumorah.
Hmm.
And so we can either look for evidence to corroborate what they said or to repudiate what they said about Cumorah. And that's really where the difference of opinion on all this is. Everything else flows from those assumptions. And
Okay.
so that's why I feel like people who say the Book of Mormon took place in Malaysia, I mean, they're not irrational or stupid or anything. They make arguments that are plausible. And
Okay.
it's just a question of what you agree with. So yeah, I'm fine with everything Brant says. I just don't buy it.
Okay. So let's talk next about Cumorah. And I had the question here of Cumorah, and I've no idea where it is. Um, so let's see if I can remember the points that people would make. So, uh, you would say the prophets have taught. Certainly, I grew up. That was what I believe. Well, I sort of believed and assumed a hemispheric geography model. That was
Yeah, so
what
did
I
I
grew up
for a
with.
long time.
So, land
Yeah.
northward, North America, land southward, South America, like
Mhm.
Panama, like the narrow neck of land. So that's what I viewed, and of course
Right.
I've also believed that Hill Cumorah was in New York. So the main arguments challenging the New York Hill Cumorah. So one is that it wasn't until the early to mid 1830s did they start calling the hill near Joseph's home the Hill Cumorah. And I can't remember if it originated with Oliver Cowdery, W. Phelps, but the argument is that this then later got sort of influenced other people calling it
Right.
the Hill Cumorah, but it wasn't contemporaneously when Joseph was visited by Moroni called Hill Cumorah. And then once people started saying it and associating that hill with Cumorah, then that just became the tradition, shall we say, and even
Right.
Joseph Smith embracing it. So that would be one point.
Yeah.
I can make my other point, or if you want to respond to that, because I don't
No,
want
go
to
ahead.
go too deep
We'll
into
come
it.
back to that. Or do you want me to do that one now?
Why don't we come back to it? And the other point would
Okay.
be in the Book of Mormon, in I think it's Mormon 6:6, it talks about Mormon burying all the plates at the Hill Cumorah for the final battle.
Right.
And this is something I never noticed until I sort of dived into apologetics. It talks about him burying all the plates in Cumorah, except the plates which he gave to his son Moroni. And then
Right.
Moroni fled, from the Lamanites. They were trying to kill him. And the inference being that the hill that Moroni buried the plates, not being the same hills where the final
Right.
battle happened because he fled, and certain apologists or scholars would interpret it as here the Book of Mormon is saying, if we look at the text, that all the records were buried in Cumorah except the plates that were
Right.
given to Moroni. So they would see it as like, if you read the text carefully, that the Hill Cumorah in New York couldn't be the same hill where the final battle happened. So what would you
Yeah.
respond to those two main arguments?
Okay. Those are great questions.
Thanks.
So the first one is, we have very few records before, essentially no history of the church until Oliver Cowdery wrote those essays in 1834 and 5. We have the little journal entry that Joseph gave, the brief summary of his life, where he talked about the first vision much differently than he did later, right? And, and
1832
we,
you're referring to?
Yeah, 1832 history. That's really the
Yeah.
first glimpse of any published church history.
Yeah, that's
And
actually fair. I don't think Joseph really wrote anything down
yeah,
officially before then.
and it wasn't even published, you know, it was just in a journal somewhere.
Right.
So really the first official church history was in 1835. So, or 1834 to 5, when Oliver wrote those official essays. So prior to that, what would we expect to see if there wasn't much written about any of this? Just because they didn't use the term Cumorah before that doesn't mean it didn't exist. There was no account of John the Baptist or Peter, James, and John or any of that before 1834 and 5 either.
That's a good
So
point. That's a good
yeah,
point.
well, it's a pretty important point, you know. It
Yeah,
wasn't
that's true.
until, and I think it was actually Mormonism Unveiled that prompted them to write that history, because, you know, the Mormonism Unveiled came out in October of 1834, and that's when Oliver's first essay was written. And all through it, you can see how those 8 essays were responding to the arguments of Mormonism Unveiled. And what I think happened is they realized when Mormonism Unveiled came out, dang, we better write down this history for posterity so we have a narrative that everybody can understand and, you know, stick with. So that's why I think they formalized all those events that they talked about in those eight essays. But prior to that, we still have Lucy Mack Smith's history. And she didn't record it or dictate it until 1844 after Joseph died. But she explained to her son William that the reason she dictated it was because she was getting so tired of repeating it over and over, she was losing her voice, you know. And she had been narrating his history for essentially his whole life. And right in that history, she related Moroni's first visit. And she said that Moroni came and told him to go tell his father, and that the history, this record is in the hill of Cumorah, 3 miles from his house. And he had to go to the hill, uncover the moss and the grass from the stone, and then he'd find the record. So according to Lucy, Moroni identified the hill as Cumorah the very first time they met. Then later she recorded, I think it was 1827, she recorded that when Joseph Smith came home late one night, they asked where he was, and he said, well, I'd been reprimanded. And his father got upset. Who reprimanded you? And he says, calm down, it was Moroni. When I was passing the hill of Cumorah where the plates are, this Moroni told me I needed to get going, and I was getting close to the time to get the plates. So that's all he had to do to describe it, because his family knew where the hill of Cumorah was. They knew it by
Is this
name.
recorded, you said, by Lucy?
Yeah, this is
Okay.
Lucy's account.
Because what if well, you keep going, but I know what the
Well,
pushback would be that,
well,
well,
of
if
course,
she's writing this in
yeah,
1844, by that time,
exactly.
the tradition,
Yeah,
everyone's referring it to the Hill Cumorah, so then she's
right.
retrofitting it back to,
Of
you know,
course, of
1827.
course. That's what else could they say? They have to say that. But when you think about it in a realistic way, her history is the main source for everything we know about Joseph's early life. So if you take the approach that they isolate Cumorah as something that came later, but if that's the case, her entire history could have come based on legends that came later. So you might as well throw the whole thing away. Instead, you have to look for corroborating indicia, right? So I'll give you a few. There was Joseph Smith himself in DNC 12820 when he said glad tidings from Cumorah, and he said a book to be revealed. So that he got the glad tidings of Cumorah before he got the plates, which is what his mother said, that he knew Cumorah, the name Cumorah, before he ever got the plates. And that's pretty explicit, and that's Joseph Smith himself. Now I know they'll say, well, he adopted this false tradition. But if you go there, pretty much everything Joseph Smith said, you might as well dismiss as a false tradition.
Was that part of the Wentworth letter, or is that a different, that
It's a
revelation?
different letter. Yeah, it's a
Different
different
letter.
letter. He wrote it. And this is another interesting thing. He wrote the letter and sent it to the editor of the Times and Seasons, even though he was supposedly the editor. You know, he sent it to them to publish it. So that's another indication he was not the editor. But then we also have Parley Pratt, who he went on that mission to the Lamanites in 1830 or 1830-31 timeframe. And he, in his autobiography, he quotes Oliver Cowdery. This is again in 1830, telling people that the hill of Cumorah was called Cumorah anciently by Moroni. So that corroborates what Lucy and Joseph Smith said. And this is right in 1830 on the mission to the Lamanites. Then you have Parley Pratt later in his book, A Voice of Warning, repeating that, saying it was called the Cumorah anciently. Then you have, and one of my favorites, which used to be in the Institute manual, but they've taken it out in the last few years, was when Joseph Smith had David Whitmer come pick him up from Harmony. So let me, just for people who may not be familiar with this. So Joseph and Oliver translated all of the abridged plates in Harmony, Pennsylvania. And then when they got to the end, the title page, they thought about going back to retranslate the Book of Lehi that was the lost 116 pages. And the Lord gave him D&C 10, which says, don't go back and retranslate. Now you have to translate the plates of Nephi. And as an aside, he didn't have the plates of Nephi at that point, in my view, and we can come back to that if you want. But so he had to get the plates of Nephi. He didn't get those till he got to Fayette. But what we do know for sure is before he left Harmony, he gave the plates to a messenger. And when David Whitmer picked him up and they were heading up to Fayette, they passed this messenger on the side of the road. And David asked him, "Do you want to ride to Fayette?" And the messenger said, "No, I'm going to Cumorah."
Right, I remember
And
this
David,
story. Who's this
well,
account written by?
This was David Whitmer told
David
it
Whitmer.
to Joseph F. Smith and to Edward Stevenson.
Right, okay.
But there's an important part of this that people didn't know about or whatever that I've talked about. First off, it's an indicia of credibility is when they remember the first time something happened. And David specifically said that was the first time he ever heard the word Cumorah, and he didn't know what it meant. Because, he's a farmer. He knew all the towns in the area. He didn't know what this Cumorah was because, of course, he hadn't read the manuscript, right? But he remembered the very first time he heard Cumorah, and it was from this messenger taking the plates to Cumorah, and this was in 1829, right? Now, he related those accounts in the 1870s during interviews that he had. But Edward Stevenson wrote that before he went back east to interview David Whitmer and everybody else, Zina Young, who is one of Brigham's wives, asked him to ask David Whitmer about that event. And the only connection between Zina and David Whitmer was David Whitmer and Hiram Smith were the missionaries that converted her family when she was a girl. And she wrote a recollection of this saying that they all wanted Hiram to baptize them because he was more handsome than David Whitmer, these young girls. And so that was all the way back in 1832. And so we infer from that, since she asked Edward Stevenson to ask David Whitmer about that specific event, meeting the messenger, that she remembered it all the way from 1832 when she had heard, when David Whitmer preached the gospel to her. Because after that, they never crossed paths again after that first missionary experience. So here's a few examples of corroborating what Lucy said. It wasn't just Lucy making it up. Yeah.
Mm.
And so you can date it all the way back to 1829, which is before the Book of Mormon was published, before it was even finished translating. The messenger saying he's going to Cumorah. I think that's pretty significant,
And what if somebody were to say that, because I think that's important what you pointed out. What if somebody were to say that in Joseph's official history, he just refers to the hill as the hill near his home?
Yeah, I've answered all that too. When you read his history, what was his audience? He was addressing the world in general, not people who had read the Book of Mormon. So if he had said, well, the hill Cumorah, it would have meant nothing to them. And even Oliver Cowdery, when he first identified the hill as Cumorah as being a fact, he prefaced it with a long description. He said, when you're on the mail road from Palmyra down to Manchester, as you're going south, on the left side, there's a hill that's taller than all the other hills. That's how he had to describe it, because nobody by then would have known where that hill was. And he said that was the hill Cumorah. And from the hill Cumorah, if you look west, a mile away, there's another ridge that's parallel. And it was between those hills that these last battles took place. That's a lot of specificity. In fact, it's talking about books. My book about Cumorah is called Between These Hills. It's my case for that Cumorah.
I think I just missed, who'd you say, who was
Oliver
that source? Oliver
This was Oliver when he wrote about them. So he said it was between these hills that these battles took place, but he said it was a fact. And so, I get a lot of pushback because, well, in my little book about this is called Letter 7. I don't know if you've seen that one, but this is Oliver Cowdery's message to the world about the Hill Cumorah. It was the 7th of the 8 essays that he talked about Cumorah. So I get pushback on this from some particular well-known church historians who tell me that I shouldn't rely on this because Oliver Cowdery didn't mention the first vision. Therefore, we don't know if he's credible. And my response to that is, well, he would only mention the first vision if Joseph Smith either told him about it or told him to talk about it. But at the time, Joseph Smith wasn't talking about the first vision at all. His own mother and his brother William both said that when Joseph Smith prayed to know which church was true, it was Moroni who came.
It was the angel. Yeah.
Yeah. It was the angel Moroni specifically, and told him about the plates and all that. So that tells me that Joseph never told anybody about the first vision at the time. In fact, he told one minister who freaked out and said, "You're terrible," and all that. That's the only person he ever told that we know of. And so naturally, his mother would not talk about the first vision. His brother didn't talk about it, and Oliver Cowdery didn't talk about it. And what's really interesting on this, hopefully it's not too much of a digression. So Lucy Mack Smith did 2 versions of her account. The first one she dictated in 1844, and then they did a second one in 1844 to 5. But the second one is a lot of editorial input. For example, where she should have talked about the first vision, they just copied Joseph Smith's history into her journal verbatim. So she never said anything about the first vision. She had never heard about it before. But the editor said, well, we'll put Joseph Smith's account where it should be in her history. That's the kind of stuff that was going on. So if anything, that tells me Lucy has even more credibility, because she just related things as she heard them and remembered them. Maybe she took notes, I don't know.
Because you're saying, because if she's writing her history in 1844, the first vision accounts would have been published by that stage, so she could have referred to it and retrofitted it back.
Exactly. If she was manipulating her history, she would have included the first vision, far more than mentioning Cumorah, right? Because by then the first vision had been published in the Times and Seasons. It was a big deal in the 1842 Times and Seasons, the history of Joseph Smith and all that. But she didn't incorporate that at all. So that tells me she was relating what she remembered as she remembered it.
Okay.
That's why when these guys come in and say, well, she must have been incorporating this idea of this narrative about Cumorah, I say, well, why didn't she incorporate the first vision then, of all things, So that's
so
my
you
response.
believe the early saints, contemporaneously, really from 1830 onwards, they're referring to the hill in New York as the Hill Cumorah, and there wasn't much being written down, prior to the early 1830s.
Right. Yeah. Well, and even in the 1820s, because Lucy knew where the Hill Cumorah was before Joseph ever got the plates. All he had to do is say I was passing the Hill Cumorah. He didn't have to say, I was passing this big hill on the mail road to, the way Oliver Cowdery described it. He just said the Hill Cumorah. His whole family knew the Hill Cumorah.
So what's your response to the scripture in Mormon 6:6? Because someone might say that, okay, maybe Joseph believed that, maybe all the early saints believed that, but if the text of the Book of Mormon is priority, so if the text is saying that Moroni or Mormon buried all the plates in Cumorah except the ones he gave to Moroni, and Moroni fled, then that's sort of above what Joseph and the early saints believed or said about the Hill Cumorah. Even if they believed it was fact, they could have been mistaken.
Yeah. I'll give you 2 responses to that. First is Orson Pratt. Orson Pratt explicitly said there were 2 departments in the Hill Cumorah. There is a repository of all the records, and then there was the stone box that Moroni created. 2 separate departments in the hill. And Mark Allen Wright asked me, he says, well, if the repository was there, why didn't Moroni just leave the record there? Why did he have to build a separate stone box? And I said, well, do you remember why it took Joseph Smith 4 years to get the plates? And he thought about it, and he goes, okay, I see your point. Because as Oliver Cowdery describes it in depth, and Joseph a little bit, just seeing the plates themselves, remember he set the plates out to see if there was anything else in there he could get to sell, to make money
Mhm.
with. And that's why he had to wait 4 years to overcome that temptation. And that was just with a set of plates, the little spectacles, and a breastplate. Imagine if he had walked into the repository full of all the Nephite records. He wouldn't have been able to handle that. And there's a real interesting detail that David Whitmer told that never made sense to me until I realized this. When they were going on that road to Fayette, and they met the messenger, and the messenger said he's going to Cumorah. He said he turned to Joseph, and Joseph looked pale or white as a sheet. And that never made sense to me until I realized that would have been the first time Joseph realized that the repository that he had just talked about when he translated Mormon 6:6 was in the same hill. And I could see how that would make him go white because he's still in poverty and all this stuff. And he's thinking back, oh, there's got to be treasures in there that I could get, but I can't do it because now I'm mature enough and I know. But that's the only explanation I can think of for why he would have turned pale when learning that this messenger was taking the place to Cumorah.
And
I
so
think
would
that's
you believe that Moroni did flee with the plates, but then you would surmise that he went back to that same hill? Is that what
well,
you
I
would
don't know
say?
how far he never says how far he fled.
Mm-hmm.
He knew that if he went south, he would have gotten caught, right?
Right,
Because
right.
everybody else. So he had to hang around in the vicinity. Now, there's an interesting angle on this too. Do you know about the room in the Hill Cumorah that was discovered a few years ago? Have you
I've
heard
heard
about
about
that?
it, but I don't know much about it.
Okay. Well, and this is, I, I don't know how much time we have for me to explain all this, but there was
I think we
the
may
way,
have to do another part.
okay, but the way that Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and Wilford Woodruff described the repository, according to Oliver Cowdery, was that it was a room that was, I don't remember the dimension now, 16 feet square, something like that, with plates stacked high on it and a table and all that stuff, right? And so the one idea is that Moroni hid out in there in the repository if he had enough food and water, you know. So that's one idea. In fact, that's why, and let me back up a minute on this Jaredite thing, because the Jaredites call it the hill Rama.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody says, well, why would a Mormon go to the Hill Cumorah there in upstate New York? You know, why was that a strategic place for him? My view is it's because there was a Jaredite fortress there already that he knew about that he could just go and occupy and put their records in. And it's all underground. There's multiple rooms down there. Well, some years ago, according to this is secondhand, I haven't been there myself, but I talked to the guy who took the pictures. In the Hill Cumorah, there's a kid that fell into a room up on top of the hill near where the monument is. And when they had to pull him out with a rope and they took pictures of it, and I have the pictures. And it's an underground room that fits the dimensions that they talked about. And it's all built of kind of built up brick around it. Not brick, but stones. And
Really?
so, yeah, and so people said, well, that wouldn't have been in the repository because it would have been full of records, according to Oliver Cowdery. But what they forgot is, first off, Oliver and David Whitmer both said the records were no longer there. And second, David Whitmer or Brigham Young said there was many wagon loads of records. And how would he know that there were many wagon loads unless Joseph and Oliver moved all the records back to the Hill Shem? Which is what I think happened. So that's why David Whitmer, when he was asked where the plates were, he said they're in New York, and they said, where in New York? And are they in Hill Cumorah? And he said, no, but they're not far from there. And that tells me that Hill Shem was not far from Cumorah, and they moved everything back. Now that's a whole long discussion. But the reason I bring it up is that this room that this kid fell in, opened from the top, like a trap door kind of. And you can see that makes sense because Oliver said when he went to the room, the hill opened and they went inside. And when I was a kid, I was thinking like an elevator door or something, you know, how would this room open? But if it opened from the top, that's literally what it would do. It would open and then they would go in. And so, and then you could close the trap door and cover it with branches or whatever. The Lamanites would never find it. And so that's possible that that's where Moroni hung out for a while. It's also possible in the Great Lakes areas, there's lots of hiding places. You could just hang out there until the Lamanites left. No problem. But it's just bizarre to me to read Mormon 6:6 and conclude that Moroni could not have also created a stone box on the same hill. It didn't say or imply anything of the sort. Mormon just says he has a repository there because he knew they'd be safe. But what Moroni did with it was a whole different thing. And Moroni could have said, I guess, in his last engraving, he could have said, I am now about to bury the plates in the stone box in the Hill Cumorah. He could have said that, but there was no point in saying that because he knew he was going to come to Joseph Smith and tell him they were in the Hill Cumorah. So why would he have to put it in the record? Just there's a lot of disconnects there.
And the last criticism about the New York Hill Cumorah, and this would come from either ex-members or critics or sometimes Mesoamerica people, they would say that like I've heard people say, like, archaeologically it seems like a clean hill. They've not found evidence of the great battles there, and I remember reading a statement that we must look elsewhere. This was not the Nephites' final demise. What's your response to that?
I have very detailed responses to those articles line by line that I can give you, but I can give you the summary of it.
That would be great.
The first question is, what were the great battles there? There's this idea going around that 2 million people were killed there, which completely contradicts what the text says, because the 2 millions were Coriantumr reflecting back on his history, the entire Jaredite history, and saying he realized Ether was right, that when we were wicked, we were destroyed. And I amortize that over 33 generations, 2 million people killed, and it adds up to about 2,000 people a year, which is consistent with the archaeology in that area, or all of North America, really. And then it was over 4 years later when they had the battle at Cumorah. Oliver Cowdery said there were thousands of Jaredites. He didn't even say tens of thousands. And if you look at the last chapter in Ether, when it enumerates how many people died each day, there's a week-long battle. I did a little spreadsheet to go, retrospectively, and it was 9,000 or something. So less than 10,000, which is consistent with what Oliver Cowdery said. So if you had 9,000 people of Jaredites killed at Cumorah in BC era, let's say 1 to 300 BC, you would not find any evidence of it. And an example that I give is the Battle of Hastings there in England.
Sure.
Because they don't know where that took place, and that was far more recently, and it was 10,000 people, right?
Yeah, I think we can have unrealistic expectations of what we'll find from battles and warfare.
Yeah, exactly. So then when it comes to the Nephites and Lamanites, Oliver Cowdery said tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands. And when you read the account, people infer that Moronites or Mormons said there were 230,000 people, right? You hear that a lot because he says he lists him and Moroni and then 21
10,000 and
10,000. So my response to that is, well, 10,000 is clearly a military unit. It's not an enumeration, because he wouldn't have said 9,997. It's 10,000.
I think I've heard other scholars, make that same argument or statement. I think that's quite likely.
Yeah, and that's common. I talk often about the Anabasis, Xenophon's Anabasis, the Greek work. When I studied Greek, we had to read the Anabasis. And he talks about the 10,000 also there. By the end of the trip, I think they had 3,000 or 4,000 left, but they were still called the 10,000. So right there, you have to cut off the idea that there were 10,000 in each of these military units. By the way, I also think there were military units of 2,000 and 6,000. And I could show you from the text. It's really interesting to look at it that way. But anyway, so Moroni said, or Mormon said he could see his 10,000 and Moroni's 10,000. Those are the only two he said that they could see from the Hill Cumorah. All the rest of them, or he said, and all these other people died with their 10,000, but that was after decades of battles. And when you look back at his list, he said at one point he had an army of 40,000. A few years later, he had an army of 30,000 after gathering all the people together. So how could he have come up with 230,000 after even more years of retreat, battle, and mayhem? It just doesn't make sense. You have to look at what Mormon said as referring to his military history, looking back on all of his commanders and their units. So that leaves us with 2 units of 10,000 people, which could have been as few as 6,000 or 7,000 or even fewer in each one. So let's say there were 10,000 Nephites. and then an overpowering battle of or number of Lamanites coming. In fact, that's what this map depicts. I didn't show you my
You're
painting.
yeah, you're some artist. That's so describe us, what is this, what's happening in this painting?
Let me explain you this. Okay, so this is Mormon and Moroni, and the reason I put a cape on them is the Book of Mormon says they had a cloak
Okay.
at one point. I figured, okay, it looks kind of cool. This is the repository where all the plates were.
Where
With
the
the
little boy fell in, supposedly.
yeah,
Okay.
right. This would be the abridged records that he was abridging, that he was going to give to Moroni. All the rest of them are down in there. So he's going to give these to Moroni. This is the camp of the Nephites here. This is the embankments around them. And then over here on the hill is the hill that's a mile away that Oliver Cowdery just described. There's little campfires, the Lamanites over there.
Is
So
that the
this
hill
is
you
the
said
night
it's called
before
Shem? Or
No,
is that
no,
a different hill?
that's a different one.
Oh.
That was the one where Amron had the plates when Moroni or Morin was a
Oh
young boy.
yeah. Yeah.
And that I think is a couple miles further west from here, but that's a separate discussion.
Okay.
So, but here's the reason I did this painting, because when I lived out there, I studied all the topography. This is all accurate in terms of height and everything. But there's a very detailed topographical map of this valley between these two hills. And there's one little point like this in there. It's two straight lines with a V shape. And you can still see it on the topographical map today. And I thought, well, that's a perfect way to do a fortification. The rest of it's all farmed and plowed, so it's all gone. But it would look like this, where you have this fortification where you always have crossfire. So when Heber C. Kimball joined the church back in 1832, and this is another indication of the antiquity of the name Cumorah, he and Brigham Young joined the church in 1832. And he said in his journal that he went to see Cumorah for himself. And he said the embankments were still around the hill in 1832. So he knew it was Cumorah in 1832. It didn't start with Oliver Cowdery in 1835, like these guys might you think. But he also saw the embankments. And if you look on a detailed topographical map, there's still one little embankment left. It doesn't make any sense if this was just a field. So I look at all this map as you got the repository, the embankment, the hill, everything Oliver Cowdery said fits this. And to me, it's become a reality. And, you know, when I lived out there, we used to be able to walk to Cumorah because our house was just up the street from there. And another objection I'll anticipate, which is people say, well, these moraines, these glacial moraines are just piles of gravel. You couldn't have a cave in there, right?
I wasn't going to bring that up, but okay, respond to that.
Yeah. Well, I've got a backhoe and I've dug up into these glacial moraines because I want to know for myself. And you go down about 3 or 4 feet and it becomes solid clay, which is a very difficult thing to dig through. I couldn't even get through it with a backhoe very easily. But if you dug it out, it would make a perfectly good man-made cave in there. Not to mention there's a whole system of subterranean caves all along this area. But so I've gone through pretty much every objection, and I know our time's probably about up, but if you hit me with any more that you want to do real quick,
well,
I'd be happy
I feel like this could be a good place to stop, at least for part 1. And we can talk after if we want to keep going and do a separate part or reschedule for another day, because I still have a lot of questions I want to bring up. But I think this has been a good discussion about your view, of Book of Mormon geography, understanding, you know, your view in North America, talking about the Hill Cumorah and what you believe Joseph knew as well. And I'd like to do a part 2, sort of bringing up more of the challenges or things that scholars would say, sort of critiquing Heartland geography and maybe other things like that. I think that would be good as well.
And in part 2, you know, you mentioned that there's not a detailed map, and here's a book that's full of maps, detailed maps.
What book's that?
Explaining all this. It just says Moroni's America Maps Edition.
And who's this by? Is this you?
Well, this is that same Ryan Nelson put it together because he's a graphics guy, and he thought my maps were too black and white. So he added a lot of color and stuff to them. But there's a lot of detail in here.
Right.
And
I think I've seen
it's also,
actually a couple of those maps online.
yeah.
It
Yeah, there's
looks
a few of
familiar.
these are online. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Online. But for me, it's just the basic general overall geography that matters. And for me, the Book of Mormon describes North America with Cumorah and New York. It's pretty straightforward in my view, but
Well, this has been a really intriguing discussion. I'm definitely going to link in the description your interviews and also your books. I want to
okay.
read some of your books as well, because I think if people are really trying to figure out and decide on, a Book of Mormon geography model, I think it's important to read the best arguments
Yeah.
and scholarship and books for proposing for Mesoamerica geography.
Yeah.
But then also, if you want to hear the best of the other side as well, and then come to your own conclusion. I remember having a discussion with Ugo Prego, and because some
Yeah.
people might see it as there's different geography models. So a critic might say that like the Heartlanders are trying to invalidate the Mesoamerican model.
Yeah.
The Mesoamerica are trying to invalidate the Heartland model. So this shows
Yeah.
that there's no good geographical model for the Book of Mormon. I think that could be one of the downsides of there being different
Yeah.
geographical models.
Definitely.
Is it can seem like, well, no, like it just clearly isn't anywhere. But I like that he said to me he just likes that like there's multiple options,
Yeah. Yeah.
a
Well,
backup
there's
option.
from a faithful standpoint, it's nice to have different options. And I've had bishops tell me they're so glad they have the Heartland because people come to them and say the meso doesn't make any sense. And they say, well, you don't have to believe meso. How about this? There's a Heartland
Try
model.
this.
and I appreciate that point of view. In my view, it would be far better if everybody just agreed with the teachings of the prophets about Cumorah as a starting point. That's the pin in the map. And then have whatever views you want based on that. But don't say the prophets were wrong or Lucy Mack Smith made it up or any of that stuff, because all that does is undermine faith.
Okay, I
You
want to
start
ask you
saying,
one last question
yeah, go
about
ahead.
that. I was going to ask it at the end of part two,
Okay.
but I think it's relevant now. Is
Okay.
so if you're saying that Joseph Smith and the early saints, and when you say the prophets, I like you to clarify because I do believe that probably from Joseph Smith, they all sort of taught and accepted that the Hill Cumorah was in New York.
Right. Mhm.
But what was even the question I was going to bring up? What was I saying? Sorry, my
I don't know.
mind
You
went
said
blank.
you had a question you were going to save for the end, and then you thought this is a good time.
Oh yes,
So,
no, it came back.
okay.
So if you're saying that Joseph Smith knew where the geography was and the early saints, they knew that it was in North America, that the Hill Cumorah was in New York, what is your theory on them? Why is the church backed away from having an official position? Because people interpret that as like
Yeah.
it's never been revealed, it's never been known, it's not like a doctrinal matter,
Right.
it's not something that's been
Yeah.
revealed from the Lord. So
No.
then why,
Yeah.
if it had been revealed and if it was sort of I don't know if doctrine is the right word, but if it was sort of like fact, like this is where Cumorah is and this is where the Book of Mormon took
Mhm.
place, then why has the church now sort of backed away that like we don't know, kind of like I plead the fifth.
Well, it's related to the issue of why did they back away from the Urim and Thummim? But let's take the Hill Cumorah as an example. The brethren have always, well, when you say the brethren, you have to identify individuals to be fair, I guess. But let's say Marion G. Romney, for example, he talked about this in general conference. And he said,
Mm-hmm.
I was on the Hill Cumorah looking over where the battles took place, right?
Right.
But the most consistent thing is Hill Cumorah is in New York, and we don't know where the rest of the events took place. As I started off by saying that. And that's really the only answer anybody can give, because of the multitude of possible locations, that many of which have been destroyed. Why the church backed off from the Hill Cumorah is, in my view, one way to look at it is inexplicable, but the other is to say that the Mesoamerican scholars have been teaching this for so long now, starting in the 1950s, that everybody who's in church leadership now has been taught the two Cumorahs theory their whole life, pretty much. I mean, even me, I'm about as old as most of the general authorities, right? And I'm younger than some, older than others.
You're
And
still
I
very
was
useful
taught
though.
this. Yeah, but I hope so. In spirit, if nothing else. But the if I hadn't looked into this myself, I would be going along with everybody else too, because that's what I was taught. And the way there's a saying that the people who know the least about the gospel are the people in leadership, not the least about the gospel per se, but at least about these kind of things, because
You don't have the time to really research and dig in.
yeah, bishops, stake president, they never go to Sunday school, they don't. I've been in I'm in a bishopric now, and we don't have time to sit around and ponder the mysteries of the gospel. You're always ministering to people, dealing with callings and organizing sacrament meeting and welfare cases. It just never ends. And the higher you are in church leadership, the more demanding it is. So they say, just like they hire an architect to design a temple, they hire Book of Mormon Central to tell them about the Book of Mormon, in terms of the historicity and the
Right.
evidence of it.
Yeah,
So
they would almost view it as
that all
this
makes
is a
sense.
scholarly endeavor rather than a
Yeah,
doctrinal or a revealed matter, a revelation matter.
right. And when they say, well, Oliver Cowdery didn't claim a revelation to say it was a fact that Hill Cumorah was there, my answer is, well, he didn't claim it was a revelation when John the Baptist came either. It was an experience. It wasn't a revelation. It wasn't a vision. It was an experience. And he had the experience of going in the repository multiple times for himself. So he knew it was there. If anybody could say it was a fact, it was him and Joseph Smith, right?
I've
And
heard
when
some apologists state that those accounts of them going to the depository in the Hill Cumorah are like late, and they're coming from like, is it people like Brigham Young and is it like Orson Pratt and others? I'm trying to remember from
well,
memory.
Brigham
So
Young and
could
Hebrew
these be
Kimball.
like stories which have sort of kind of like folklore stories, if that makes sense? Like, is there anything firsthand from Oliver or Joseph about that? Do you have a quick response?
Well, that's the only way they can justify their M2C, the Mesoamerican stuff. But Brigham Young specifically said that Oliver didn't talk about this in public or in meetings. But he said, I'm going to tell you now because I'm afraid it'll be forgotten if I don't talk about it. And this was in the second to last sermon he ever gave before he died. And he knew he was going to die. And he was afraid this knowledge would be lost to the church. So he spelled it out. And that, to me, that's a pretty strong indication of veracity right there, that shortly, there's an exception in hearsay evidence in law called the dying declaration. And this was essentially a dying declaration from Brigham Young saying, I'm afraid this is going to be lost if I don't spell it out right now. So he described it. But Oliver Cowdery himself said they were no longer in the Hill Cumorah. So how would he know that? But when he said it was a fact, I mean, he was the assistant president of the church. He'd been assigned to write this history. And to give an indication of how close Joseph Smith was working with him, he says he asked Joseph Smith what time of night it was when Moroni came. And he says Joseph couldn't tell me what time it was, but it was after everybody went to bed. That's how specific they were trying to get on this. So for him to say it was a fact, that had to be with Joseph's agreement, consent, whatever, especially when Joseph had it copied into his journal and had it republished multiple times so everybody would know it.
Oliver Cowdery is a pretty important guy. Like he was the principal scribe for the Book of Mormon. He was there for the priesthood restoration. He was there when they received like the temple keys and the sealing powers.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the witnesses as well, the gold plates.
Yeah, without Oliver Cowdery, we would have to take Joseph Smith's word all by himself for everything. And most of it Joseph never even talked about. Joseph Smith never said anything about Elijah coming to the temple. That was Warren Oliver's brother who wrote that. And so when people say, well, Joseph never wrote anything about Cumorah except for 128:20, I say, well, he never wrote anything about the restoration of the keys, really. I mean, that account wasn't written by Joseph Smith. So it's just I see a series of kind of logical and factual fallacies that these guys use to justify rejecting what Oliver Cowdery and the others said about Cumorah, because it just doesn't fit their model. I know one of the questions you were going to ask me was about what I think of the scholars. I don't know if you want to do that or save that for the next one.
Why don't we save it for the next one?
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
So part two, I think it's been a really good discussion on part one, understanding your view on Book of Mormon geography and Heartland, and talking a little about like the Hill Cumorah and such. In part two, I want to be more focused on like responding to criticisms or things trying to undermine or invalidate your geography model. as well, and then maybe we can touch on that question as well.
Sure.
But I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Yeah, me too.
I feel like you're really fascinating, and I'm learning, and while I have a geography model that I lean more towards, I'm also extremely open-minded and want to keep learning. And I like your theory of multiple working hypothesis. I try to be open-minded like that. I don't like to be fixed, while you don't want to be always going back and forth all the time and be really conflicted. But this is really interesting. So I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, I've been both a prosecutor and a defense lawyer. And as a prosecutor, I try to make a case that is just unassailable, the jury's going to buy if the defense never stands up. But as a defense lawyer, I listen to the prosecutor. Okay, I have to sit there in silence and make the whole case. But then I can get up and do my defense, and you can see the jury's minds just changing back over to the other side. Yeah. And so you really have to hear both sides to make a fair assessment.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. But thanks so much for coming on, and listeners who've been watching, I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your comments, any questions as well. And also, I think what could be really good as well is write up any questions in the comments that you would like me to ask for part 2. I might even put a post out for part 2. And hopefully we can have another really good discussion. I feel like it's been respectful. I've really appreciated your thoughts.
I've enjoyed it too.
Your insights. And
appreciate your questions too.
Thank you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.